Okay, forging ahead, 26.3 Cnidarians. Now, Phylum Cnidaria is a group of critters you've seen before, you're probably familiar with. They include the anemones, like you saw in the movie Finding Nemo. Marlin and Nemo had a little anemone home that they lived in. And the jellyfish. Now, what maybe you didn't realize watching the movie Finding Nemo is that anemones and jellyfish are a stinging invertebrate belonging to a group that we know as the Cnidarians, sometimes in an older sense known as the Coelenterids, but we'll run with the name Cnidarians and keep it simple. So what do we have for you? Let me just open up this link here called the Cnidarians. And brief description, again, we're looking at a radially symmetrical animal, the little mouth in the middle, but they're able to sting quite handily with these little harpoons they have built into their flesh, more or less, called nematocysts. And thus they have the name Cnidarians, the stinging, more or less the stinging animals. So we'll have our video lesson in place here. Meet the Cnidarians, neat little flash video. That's a Tim and Moby one. Go to the web, and that's just a freely accessible link. Includes a little quiz at the end of it. And I'll start with an animation just on the generalized body plan of a Cnidarian, and there's really only two real things to it. So before I press play, I should define a few things. The Cnidarians will look like the jellyfish phase that you see here, or we'll see something that looks like, now they're saying hydra here, but I like the term polyp better. Polyp, like a flower. And if you've ever gone to a dock and looked off the side of a dock, you'll see something that looks sort of anemone-like, something like this, with its little tentacles sticking out. And they were mistaken for plants for a very long time because they looked so colorful and plant-like. In fact, algae will grow on them, for goodness sake, and they will appear green just because the algae are growing upon them. That doesn't necessitate that they're a plant. Of course not. These are animals that are consuming basically whatever they can sting and get to their mouths.
Cnidarians have two body forms, the bill-shaped Medusa and the vase-shaped Polyp.
Okay, so we'll pause that. When we look at a second here, I just want to set my audio. There we go, so that I can hear it on my headset. There's just the two shapes. We like to refer to this as the polyp, and this is the Medusa. And it's a nice little simple animation for you. And as we study them, there's three major groups that we're going to look at. The Anthozoans, which are really only in the polyp phase. Scyphozoans, which are our traditional jellyfish that I like to say skiff along the surface of the water. It kind of describes to me how they move. Our Hydrazones, which I like to refer to and let students know is the sort of crazy colonial polyp example. So we'll get into these, and I've got all sorts of goodies for you because they're very. This is cryptobiology at its best, but we'll break it down and make it simple. Okay, we'll pop out to our notes. So I'll just get our notes rolling. Oh, we're good to go. All right, one moment. There we go, and should be reflecting. Okay, so the Cnidarians. So there's our polyp and our Medusa phase. If you're not familiar with Greek mythology, that looks like the Gorgon Medusa. She was basically a Greek figure who was turned into a hideous creature that could turn you to stone by just gazing at you, and her hair was composed of snakes. So this shape was named more or less sort of after that Greek mythological character. Okay, so what are Cnidarians? They're soft-bodied You're not really going to find a fossilized cnidarian. Now, interestingly enough, coral fall into the cnidarian category, and when we look at coral, you'll see that what's really inside of that hard coral is just a soft uh, little polyp. And I remember the movie The Little Mermaid when Ariel swims along and these little things are sticking out and they look like flowers. In fact, those aren't flowers. Those are little polyps and they're reaching out and feeding on whatever little scraps they can more or less get. They're soft bodied. They're really not much different from an anemone, except that they're sort of living in a hard shell that they build up. So, cnidarians are soft bodied. They're carnivorous, they have stinging tentacles, and their mouth is kind of in the center. What's really gross about cnidarians is that they really only have a one-way digestive tract, so anything they eat will be more or less expelled out their mouth once they're done digesting it. They have a really simple body plan. It's all about radial symmetry with these guys, and they do have specialized tissues for digestion and reproduction, stinging you, and so on and so forth. So we'll get right into this. Now it gets really interesting when you examine just what it is that they sting you with. Now a jellyfish, if you touch its basically if you touch its tentacles or if you touch the tentacle of an anemone, you will get stung. It's not really up to them. They sort of sting on contact. And if we zoom in, they have specialized little cells that are responsible for this stinging. So if we look at a tentacle like that and we zoom in on these regions and you see these little barbs here, well, what we have is those little barbs are triggers. And it's like a hair trigger. If the trigger is touched, then inside, now let's see if I can pull up my tools. There we go. Inside, the trigger is touched, and what will happen is that water is able to make it in here and it pushes this thing out. And what this thing is basically like a little harpoon, and it can be steeped in poisons that sting us, injure us, and in some cases can be pretty lethal. If you look at jellyfish stings, you don't think of this in British Columbia, although we do have the lion's mane jellyfish floating off the coast, which is very deadly. But down in Florida, for example, where the waters are much warmer, you have to watch out for jellyfish, especially things like the Portuguese man-o'-war, which we'll look at soon enough. When that barb comes out, it comes out with the idea of just poking into its target and applying a chemical. Now, that chemical can create a stinging sensation. It can be bad, and depending on what that chemical is, it can be very bad. So that was a very clear diagram. I like that. The cells are called cnidocytes that contain these little harpoons known as, we should name the harpoons, they're called nematocysts. Right there. So pretty nasty stuff. They got little built-in stinging nematocysts. Okay. And here's another little view of it. The nematocyst could be called a poison-filled dart. Which on contact just drives into whatever the jellyfish comes in contact with, or the anemone. The anemone is characteristic of the polyp phase, so you're really looking at a medusa or a polyp. You'll hear me say jellyfish and you'll hear me say anemone quite frequently because they kind of represent the two body forms. Now, jellyfish stings can be something else. I mean, take a look at this here. Now, if you're swimming through the water, they can be quite hard to see. You're swimming along, and suddenly you've passed through a jellyfish field, and if the tentacles make contact, you'll get these sort of horrendous stings. Talk about something that a little sign that you don't see right around, the central interior of British Columbia, jellyfish. Um, you would think you'd be worried about a lot of other things swimming on the beach, but see a sign like this and you suddenly realize, wow, this isn't something I thought about as a tourist. Honolulu, if you've been there, this poor fellow ran right into quite a few jellyfish, it looks like, and I can tell he's on Waikiki Beach with its beautiful, characteristic white sand. And it was all due to having this barb driven into the flesh. And it's pretty nasty. Let's pop out. True to form, I have a flash animation for you on this. Neat that describes how this works. So the Cnidarians, let's pop in. Okay. Now it's a little bit, I have to remember where I put it. How did nematocysts work? Click on that and start the animation.
Some cells in the cnidarian epithelium contain capsules called nematocysts, which function in feeding and defense. The type of nematocyst depicted here is released if prey brushes against the trigger. This contact makes the capsule more permeable to water, which diffuses inward. Trigger pressure in the capsule increases rapidly, which forces the coiled thread inside to shoot out. A barb at the tip of the thread can pierce and capture prey.
So there you go. Nice little animation on exactly how that works. We'll get back to our notes here. There we go. Zoom back out. So these jellyfish stings can be pretty extreme. The Portuguese man o' war, if you get stung by enough of these jellyfish, it can be fatal. And depending on the jellyfish, the man o' war, you don't want to get stung by that at all. And there are a great number of people that will have an anaphylactic reaction, an allergic reaction to a jellyfish sting. Well, with good reason, because of the chemicals that are being injected into the body. It's very hard to know if you're allergic to a jellyfish sting until you're stung. So it's not like something you'd experiment with. It can out of the blue kill some people who first encountered jellyfish. Very first time allergic reaction, that can be it. Radial symmetry, we've talked about that quite a bit. So form and function, we sort of zoom out and look at the body plan, the radially symmetrical, and we more or less have that Polyp and Medusa phase that we're looking at that I've been talking about quite a bit. And here's our polyp with its little tentacle arms sticking up in the air like this. And you're seeing basically a cross section down here in that yellow region so that we could show you what's inside. Of course, these guys are sessile, they don't move around, so they're fixed to the bottom. When they're in their polyp phase of a life cycle. The Medusa, the best way I've heard the Medusa described is it's the mobile hunter. It's a hunting sexual phase. And not all major classes will produce a Medusa. It's something that's only certain types of Cnidarians will go through a phase like this. This is something new for our little phylum Cnidaria. The polyp phase is very, very old, and in fact, class Anthozoa is polyp only, and we think that Anthozoans are the oldest members of phylum Cnidaria. So we have to zoom in. We referred to three layers in a previous lesson. Your outer layer, which is your ectoderm, a middle layer, so we'll say that our ectoderm really is here, our mesoderm, middlemost layer, just roughly here. And our endoderm, which in general is the lining to the gut, here. And I won't write derm, but I'll just write the short versions of the words there to save space. Now, if your endoderm, its purpose is consumption, gastro is a term which means, oh, it's not going to give me the highlighting tool. There we go. Your gastroderm is basically this region here, these cells. So saying that your gastroderm and your endoderm essentially are kind of the same thing, it's interchangeable. We like to say gastroderm because these are the cells that are going to do the digesting. So if this polyp pulls in, let's say it's a rather large sized polyp like an anemone, and it pulls in a fish and is consuming it, that fish, not drawn to scale of course, that poor dead fish would be consumed in this region, and then ultimately once it breaks down and all the nutrients from that fish become one with our polyp, whatever's left comes out the top. So one of those fish skeletons we all know and love. That gastroderm cavity is also found over here in the Medusa phase. And again, it's in yellow, so we can see our gastroderm, which is really the endoderm, and our mesoderm and our ectoderm. There's three primary germinal layers, and they're present in both of our critters here. I'll give you a chance to take that in, and we'll move on. Now, as far as the nervous system goes, let's write, what do they have for a nervous system? In the previous slide, we certainly saw what they had for a digestive system. Now, there is a nerve net, a series of nerves that will coordinate the function. If you look at the tentacles, for example, that makes a lot of sense. There's a nerve net around the mouth that's able to bring food in. The whole point is that they have sensation. So it's an organized nerve network. So we're seeing a more advanced nervous system than we have ever seen in evolution to this point. SpongeBob, as much as you see on TV, it's all lovely and good, doesn't have a nerve net. So he wouldn't be running around talking to us or trying to catch jellyfish. Such abilities are beyond him. For reproduction, it's not a surprise to see that they reproduce both sexually and asexually. The polyp, which is our little friend we were just looking at, can reproduce asexually, and a trick likely learned from the sponges: just produce a bud, which is just a cloned growth off the side of yourself, and release it. Now, sexual reproduction, in this case, is external fertilization. There's no fertilizing inside of the body. So external fertilization is quite an old way to go. So it takes place outside, which is why we call it outside the female, would be specific, outside the female's body. Fish do that. It's nothing unusual. Now, if we'll just look at a general life cycle here, we'll look at the genus Aurelia, and without getting into the specific classes of jellyfish just yet, what I will say is that this is a type of Cnidarian that goes through a Medusa phase and a Polyp phase. So kind of interesting. They're not showing it really well here. I just want to advance for 1 second here to show it to you. Nope, they didn't show it. Dagnabbit. That's okay. So what really is going to happen here, and I'll zoom in, is that this is the kind of a life cycle where a polyp, which is attached to the bottom, that's little flailing arms like this, its little mouth like that. Our polyp can develop and release these jellyfish, which are just the Medusa phases and constitute a sexual phase. The whole point of producing the Medusa is to fulfill the sexual phase of the life cycle. So if these release egg and our friend here releases sperm, so we found our Romeo and Juliet, then the life cycle, what it will, of course, will produce, it would be a zygote, two-end zygote. And that develops into an interesting little planular larva. And it's segmented in an interesting way. Reminds me of a worm, and that's important. That'll come up again later in the course. So, larva. There we go. And that larva wiggles down, it swims to the bottom, it finds a place to grow up, and you're back to the polyp phase. So, interestingly enough, it can involve a polyp phase and a Medusa phase in order to accomplish the life cycle. We'll just zoom out on that. So it's nice to have my little micro diagram to the side. But what's in the slide is you're just seeing the sexual hunting phase of our Medusa. There's a little romance going on here, Romeo and Juliet, and they're just showing the production of sex cells, and that's, in an evolutionary sense, that's even what humans do. There's the production of egg and sperm, and it becomes fertilized. It's fertilized out in the open water, so they basically just release their cells, and fertilization happens out there in the water. And that zygote, you get this free swimming little larva, we refer to as a planula larva, and it swims down and finds a home. So there you go. The reason why it's neat that it can swim is it can find a home in a different place than the parents lived in. There's less crowding that way, greater chance for success of the new little organism to make it in the world. So now we've got our polyp back again. Now, what you kind of didn't see is you wonder, well, how did the polyp ever release a Medusa in the first place? Well, when it's time for the polyp to release the Medusa phase, and I'll just see, I think black. Yeah, black's a good color for this. You can sort of see Medusa layers in this thing. Your original Medusa is kind of here. Oh, come here, you. And you could think of these as being the tentacles. And behind that, we have another Medusa forming. And behind that, we have another Medusa forming. And these things, there we go. Once they are released, they turn over in the water. They actually know which way is up. And they swim off. And it takes time to mature. They have to hunt down food. They need energy to, obviously, for their cells to differentiate and grow and divide. But that is how the polyp phase goes to the Medusa phase. Basically through asexual reproduction, you get a bud, all right, but the polyp isn't budding off to produce other polyps. It's budding to produce a Medusa. And the Medusa is pretty critical because unless a couple of Medusas go off and have sex, you're not going to get the polyp phase back. Now, take this, make sure you understand this. There's one group that never produces Medusa, and that's the Anthozoans. The best one that you would know would be the anemones and the corals. They never do this. They just do the polyp phase. But for the Scyphozoans and Hydrazones, which we'll talk about, they do go through a phase where there is a Medusa. Okay, so at this point, they didn't define this as well as I would have liked. Um, right here, I'll just pop out the names. Okay, so your jellyfish are your Scyphozoans, your traditional jellyfish. And I'm referring to the major classes of Phylum Cnidaria. Scyphozoans, our sea anemones and our corals are Anthozoans. And our hydras, that's an interesting group. I'm going to leave them kind of the last to talk about, are known as Hydrazones. And the Portuguese man of war, which is a pretty deadly little critter, um, fits in there, as does an example that you often see schools look at, known as Obelia. That's a good genus to look at when you study the Hydrazoans. I call them the Hydrazoans the colonial freaks for a reason. You'll see why. So here's our traditional jellyfish. The Scyphozoans have a very prominent Medusa phase. So Scyphozoa will have the polyp, and it'll have the Medusa used to complete its life cycle. Remember, that's a sexual phase that's also a very strong hunting phase. Now, the Scyphozoans are spend a lot of time in the Medusa phase. So that's a distinction to make. So Scyphozoan, oh, I want to do this my way. Scyphozoa live primarily as Medusas. And a good way to remember that is that these guys like to skiff along the surface of the water. I know it sounds corny, but it's a great way to remember it, because that way you'll remember that in order to skiff along the surface of the water, they're probably in the jellyfish phase. Works for me. Next up is something known as the Hydrazoa. Now, it's an interesting mention that they're making here. Before I get to sort of the second paragraph, Hydrazoa as a class can do the polyp and Medusa phases. It will do both. Now, strangely, there's one that we call Hydra. They have a strange little member in the class, and there's one of them which lacks a Medusa phase. And it's this little solitary little weirdo down here. He's not colonial. We found this one specific example of a Hydrazoan that doesn't do the Medusa phase, but it's more like the exception. It's not the rule. So Hydrazoans are very colonial, and they do a good job of coming together. So we'll say colonial hydroids. And I sort of wish they hadn't mentioned our little friend here, because he's solitary. By colonial hydroids, I'm pointing to this right here, where you might see the first one here, but you're also seeing, what the heck is that hydra doing hanging off the side of the other hydra? Interestingly enough, they start to make sort of an arrangement where one hydra is responsible for sexual reproduction, where the other is responsible for finding food and keeping them both fed. It seems to be in their best interest to sort of work together. So this one here is interesting because this one just hangs out alone, and it's one called Hydra, and it doesn't do the Medusa phase, but as I say, it's more like an exception than the rule. Sea anemones and corals, Anthozoa. So we'll draw Nemo cruising around. Come here, pen, come back. So our little friend Nemo, our clownfish. I know, terrible drawing, but that's okay. It's just a quick little drawing, and he's happy because clownfish can survive around anemones. Either the sting doesn't matter to them or they're not feeling the sting. It's a little bit hard. We have to talk to the clownfish and find out. But Anthozoa, these only have a polyp stage, so we should highlight that. Anthozoa, right, and polyp stage only. And that's what you're seeing down here. And also over here. So if we kind of go back, these guys are polyps only. These guys do some sort of crazy um, colonial polyps. They can be very interesting, but most of them will do a sort of a little Medusa phase. And our traditional jellyfishes will do a polyp and a Medusa phase, but you've seen that I've underlined Medusa because they prefer to be in the Medusa phase. So, Scyphozoans, the crazy colonial Hydrazoas, and the Anthozoas that like to be in the polyp phase. A lot to take in, isn't it? They're pretty cryptic. Now, corals, make a note here, are Anthozoans. And before we kind of get into a few animations on these guys, coral are very important in the world. They're coral reefs are tremendous, diverse regions in our oceans. And in fact, they're just hotspots of activity, living jungles, the Amazon, if you will, under the ocean. But those coral reefs are fairly fragile in a lot of respects. They'll grow worldwide, but only in regions where the temperature is just right and the water depth is ideal. And coral reefs don't like super intense light. They really don't. So if it's too bright, you'll actually get a bleaching of the coral. And what's happening is inside of the coral, you could sort of think of a little coral, little house. And inside is our little polyp. And they're reaching up with their little tentacles, trying to get food. And you never really thought about it before, but this is an anthozoan cnidarian that's inside of there. And it secretes calcium carbonate, which is exactly what the reef is built from. It's interesting that you have carbonate because that's a great way to fix carbon dioxide in the water into something that's sort of a bone-like structure. It's a great way to get rid of carbon dioxide in the water. And we all know the implications of carbon dioxide and potentially the implications of that with global warming. Okay, now it appears you've hit the end, but you haven't. Because we have to look at these life cycles or we really haven't accomplished very much. Do you have to know the life cycles for a test? Well, let's put it this way. If you know the life cycle, you know what a medusa looks like and a polyp looks like. I wouldn't ask you the specific life cycle on a test because it's very complicated. It's not part of the package, but it would be silly not to show you it because it really reinforces how these critters do work and how they live. All right, so here's our anthozoan. It's a little YouTube video.
Here we have a coral reef. Corals and sea anemones are members of the class Anthozoa. Anthozoa is the largest class in the phylum Cnidaria and it has over 6,000 species currently in existence. Major characteristics of anthozoans include polyploidy, which means an organism has has more than 2 sets of homologous chromosomes. Tubular bodies with hollow tentacles around the mouth.
Okay, so that's its mouth in the middle, and it's eaten something and it's ejecting kind of the leftovers. So looks like a little bit of sand or something around it.
As can be seen in these pictures, and a pharynx that opens into a digestive cavity subdivided by infoldings of the gut wall. They may be solitary or colonial, and they may or may not have an exoskeleton.
Okay, so there's our coral forming because of what it is that anthozoan polyps, such as corals, do. Safe little home for them. Great little place to basically search for food. And they've created this whole ecosystem based on what they've created.
This is a sun coral. Like most other anthozoans, it is a substrate feeder. Watch as it sifts through the water to capture its prey. Because anthozoans are unable to move to catch their food, substrate feeding is extremely efficient. Others gain nutrition from symbiotic photosynthetic algae living within the clefts of their gastrodermis.
Okay, so they just reached out and grabbed their food and they're hanging on to it, and you're not going to get it away from them. What she was just referring to is that some algae will grow on them, and the algae photosynthesize, and as they grow on the corals, the corals will appear a little bit more green, and the corals get a little bit of the sugar out of the deal. It's sort of like a living arrangement. That's a real plus for the algae because they have a home, and for the coral, if the algae grow on them, well, they kind of get fed a Mars bar every now and then, if you know what I mean.
Molecular evidence places Anthozoa as the earliest branch of the phylum Cnidaria. Anthozoans exist exclusively as benthic polyps, meaning they are organisms attached to the sea floor and not free to move about. Other Cnidarians have life cycles that can alternate between the benthic polyp stage and another stage that allows free movement, which is called the pelagic stage.
Okay, so benthic means on the bottom, and pelagic means like the jellyfish um, that we'll look at later. They're pelagic because they're swimming through the upper water.
There is evidence that the pelagic stage followed the benthic stage, proof that anthozoans preceded all other Cnidarians.
Okay, so that's a good little summary there. So Anthozoa, so we're looking at anemones and corals. Scyphozoa, don't click on the quiz here. You'll get a diagram to label. There we go. So there's a lot of anatomy to our jellyfish friend here. Now Scyphozoans favor this stage, but here you go. And I really like how clear this diagram is. Males release sperm, females release their eggs, and they fertilize out in the open water. There's the planula larva that swims down to the bottom, grows up into a polyp. There's the little tentacles show up, and there's the rings. So as this begins to mature, its job is to sort of more or less feed, gain energy, and try to regenerate the Medusa phase of the life cycle that you see over here. Now, don't worry about these terms. Just keep your eye trained on the fact that medusae are more or less forming, and that these little arms are the same as these here. So as this buds off, you'll see it's called Nephira. Looks like this. Once it matures a little bit, it turns upside down and lowers its tentacles, and it goes off searching for little things it can eat or big things that it can eat, and is in its pelagic stage. This would be its benthic stage here, where it's sessile and stuck to the bottom. And then it goes off in search of a mate, and the life cycle goes around and around. But it likes to skiff along in this phase most of the time. Now, our Hydrazoids, They're they're even stranger. Hydrazoa, little flash video right here I want to show you. This is pretty neat, a little animation from the University of Alberta. Hydrazoa are when we get these crazy um, polyp colonies. And here we go. There's a lot to this, but if I break this down quite simply, at the top here, what we've got is a polyp that's purposed for a sexual phase. And on the side, we've got polyps that are purposed more for a digestive phase. So they've all come together. And there is a Medusa phase to this life cycle. It's just that when it gets around to the polyp phase, it'll make these bizarre looking little colonies. And so this is more than one polyp merged. The Medusa does what the Medusa normally would do with releasing egg and sperm out into the open water. And sure, you'll get the production. That forms a diploid zygote, and it grows into this little almost sort of segmented worm-like planula. And there it is on the bottom, growing up into a polyp, but then you get sort of a bizarre little polyp colony. And this is what defines the hydroids right here. Crazy stuff they do. And if you'd like, there's about a million things to label. I really like this jellyfish animation I put at the bottom. I wanted to show you that briefly. I don't know if anything is brief with me, but I'll do my best. So that it's a flash video from the New England Aquarium, and our jellyfish blobs of goo. Well, it's kind of interesting. Choose the features that you think are part of a jellyfish, like which body system does it have? Does it have a brain? Does it have a stomach pouch? Well, if you click on brain, no. It does have a neural network, but it's not like it has a brain. So it's neat as you go through the body systems here. Give this a little try. If you go down to life cycles, ominous music, the moon jellies, we'll click this here. So these are Scyphozoans. Let's turn the sound off because that's kind of maddening. Now, this is a wonderful animation to watch because now my cursor does this when I go over top because there's a little game on the side. Watch down here at the bottom. Here's a polyp, and here's another one that's just arisen. Now those polyps start to go through a phase where, there you go, you can see that they're producing the medusas, and then they fire it, turns over, and as it begins to mature, it's going to become a medusa. There you go, hunting and searching for a mate. So let's watch this now. So they get together, and they're releasing their egg and sperm into the water. There we go. And fertilization's happened, and there's the planula larva right there. And here's another one. And what they'll do, third one there, so settle on the bottom, search for a place to grow up, and you've got the polyp phase all over again. So you can see this phase goes around and around and around. Now, if you think you're really good, at the first part of the game, see if you can find the fertilized egg. So nicely, over here you get to wait a little while so that you can get in on the game. You sort of have to pause and figure out what's going on. So look for a fertilized egg. So wait for them to come together. Romeo and Juliet. Ah, there we go. Good work. You found the fertilized egg. And as you go through the stage, it asks you to find the different things in this Scyphozoan life cycle. And just some more information about what they call Jellytown. It's a really neat little site. You get a chance, you want to look at the Portuguese man of war, and I've made a real point of you understanding this thing is a Hydrazone. So it does have a very interesting Medusa-like phase. Take a little tour of the Portuguese man of war. This is a very deadly one to run into. Check out another variety of jellyfish we call the comb jellies here. Neat little mention here about coral reefs and the symbioses that happen with algae. There's plenty to go through here, great reviews. And I think at the bottom, oh yes, your jellyfish review is just this. Okay, so that, whoa, I'm down to 47% battery, so I went on and on. I did a better job, I think, this time of really nailing down the anthozoans, the scyphozoans, and the hydrozoans. So we have lab work to do at school where we look at the planula larva, which is characteristic of our scyphozoans, for example. We'll look at hydra, we'll look at hydroid colonies, we'll label it all up, and you really have to concentrate and think about which particular class am I looking at? What part of the life cycle am I looking at? And that's why we do those lab activities, is try to get you keyed in on what's going on. Okay, so in the meantime, in between time, folks, have a good one, and we'll see you again out there.